Okay, hi everyone, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Donna Quach and I am the program manager for the Washington Passport Network at the College Success Foundation, and want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for our monthly Washington Passport Network webinar. Today's webinar is Boarding Schools, the Lasting Ripple Effect. And we have the pleasure of welcoming back two presenters who have presented at a previous WPN webinar and then also at the Passport Conference this fall. And before I hand it off to the presenters, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items as reminders. So a reminder that all audience members are muted, and at the end of the webinar, we can unmute you if you have any questions. But throughout the webinar, feel free, and we encourage you to use the chat box if you have any questions that you want to drop in there. We have a few folks from our team who will be monitoring the chat and can relay those questions over to the presenters. And then this webinar is being recorded, so you can find the materials and the recording itself on the Washington Passport Network YouTube channel after the webinar is over. And then we do have a post-webinar survey that we invite all of you to complete at the end of the session. Okay, so at this time, I'd like to formally introduce our two presenters. So we first have Shoshaunee Perez from Northwest Indian College and Kateri from Treehouse. And I'll hand it over to them to do their formal introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shoshaunee Perez. I am Tulalip and Tlingit Hayata descendant on my mother's side. I grew up in Lakewood, Washington, so I'm from the Washington area, but I'm from the Southern Washington. I work for Northwest Indian College, which is a tribal college and university located in Bellingham, Washington. We have some extended campuses as well. I serve as the first year experience advisor and have for about the last 4 years. So it's been a really great experience. So hopefully I can give you guys some really good insights, and I'll pass it off to Kateri.
Hi everyone, my name is Kateri Jo. I am Swinomish and Tulalip First Nations. I'm the Tribal Engagement Manager over at Treehouse. So pretty much anything having to do with tribes is kind of what I do. It's kind of a new program. But thank you all for being here today and for taking the time to learn something. We definitely understand there's going to be probably variance in understanding today. This will be a review for some folks. For some folks, this will be brand new information. So let's get started. So our goals for today are for our participants to learn and discuss basically what blood memory is. That's kind of like a phrase or understanding that not a lot of people know the different context between kind of like Western viewpoint of what blood memory is and Indigenous context of what blood memory is, but how it also impacts like current generations, why boarding schools were created, and how the impacts of boarding schools manifest themselves today in our current students' experience. So first we're going to go into kind of what blood memory is. So when we think of blood memory, like in the Western viewpoint, we kind of think of epigenetics. So it's kind of the changes to a gene, like a gene link that is linked to the levels of cortisol due to like levels of high stress, right? So it's this idea that while a woman or, you know, an ancestor has experienced something significant, some kind of experience, some kind of trauma, that it is then impacts the way in which your genes or your DNA kind of then experiences your behaviorals from then on, right? So it can be just like a higher level of cortisol, so kind of experiencing like higher levels of stress. That's kind of like the Western viewpoint of like genetically what's happening, right? There's been experiments with mice to kind of explain the situation, because there's always that context of, is it nurture versus nature, right? So like when you've experienced trauma, especially as a child, and that's the way in which you understand parenting, which Shoshaunee will go into boarding schools later, then those are the habits that you then tend to practice out when you have your own family, right? But blood memory, epigenetics is basically saying that not only is it like that nurture part but it actually physically has changed the way in which you interact with your DNA. So the mice experiment was basically that they had some mice that would interact with cherry blossoms, and then they would smell and have no like negative context to it, and they were fine. All of their descendants were fine. On the Vice, there was another group of mice that had been negatively impacted whenever they smelt cherry blossom, the smell of it. I think it was, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think they got like a shock whenever they smelt cherry blossom. And from then on, all of their descendants, whether they had any specific interaction with those, that shock, they still feared the smell of cherry blossom. So it actually impacted the way in which they experienced it in their behaviors, even though they had no direct correlation with it, right? Also, like, it's also this idea, and kind of more of like a Indigenous like front, is like, is this connection between understanding through stories, through history, spirituality, and like land connection, right? Where like I've heard, like when your inner native like is longing for something, right? Like the first time you go to a powwow, or the first time you go to ceremony, and you hear specific songs, and you kind of have like this visceral reaction to it that you had never experienced it before, and you kind of feel like that moment of, this is something that I've been missing, because it's been a part of my ancestry for so long, and it's something that I've been missing, even though this is the first time I personally am interacting with it, right? So it's like this experience of the stories that you hear, just the histories that have impacted your people, your ancestors, your community, and that connection to place, right? And that connection to where your ancestors once lived. And it's that blood memory that really helps you connect to your ancestors, right? And sorry, there's a quote I wanted to read. Trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's gene, which can then be passed down through future generations. This mark does not cause a genetic mutation, but it does alter the mechanisms by which the gene is expressed. This alteration is not a genetic, but epigenetic. Genetics, parenting, social learning, and shared environmental context can also influence the outcome related to stress across generations. And, you know, we hear of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and this is kind of just like the scientific explanation of the things that people in marginalized communities haven't experienced for however long those generations have been impacted by trauma, right? There's been a lot of stories that I've heard, or anecdotes that I've heard of other folks, especially those that have, actually I'm going to share that story when Shoshaunee finishes, because she's going to go a little bit more into boarding school, so I don't want to take it over.
Before you move on, Kateri, so the example I was going to give also that may be something that others that we connect with when we were working on talking about this PowerPoint. So this is something that, like Kateri was talking about, marginalized populations have blood memory, but we all have blood memory, correct? You know, think about it kind of this way. So the example that we also talk about that's non-Indigenous is those that have Irish descent, right? Because one of the biggest things that our ancestors, I'm part Irish, I'm mostly European and Native American, but the Irish part of my roots was, they experienced the potato famine, right? And so they experienced the loss of their food, the loss of the ways to eat, and were starving. And so you may find this within yourself if you think about it, if you do have some sort, or even if you're thinking of like in the Great Depression, something that your family experienced money loss or things in the Great Depression, you may have a higher sense or a much stronger reaction to things like, for me, it's not having food in my household and making sure that my family is fed and that I have something to eat that day. For those that you may not know it, but for those that may have some sort of blood memory and tied to the Great Depression, is making sure that you always have money set aside, whether it's, you may not trust the bank because during the Great Depression, the banks, that was not a great place to have money. So having money linked somewhere, stuff behind your back of your toilet, or, places that nobody can access it, helps you to feel more calm and at ease and allows you to move forward with your life. And so those are things that make no sense to you, may not make sense to you. You're going, why do, you know, I always have food in my house. I know I can have food in my house. I always have money. My bills are always paid. But there's just something that I feel that I have to do this. And it's because of the epigenetic piece that it's in your body, it's in your DNA to have these sorts of feelings due to different things. All right, so on to the intent of boarding schools. So obviously boarding schools were created. They were done in the early, oh gosh, I forgot to write down my date, early 1800s. So the main phrase that has been known and is taught in schools even, and even at Northwest Indian College that you hear and is written about very often is the phrase, kill the Indian to save the man. This phrase was created by Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. He is the founder of Carlisle Boarding School, which is in Pennsylvania. He is not one of the original boarding schools. There were many boarding schools, and we'll kind of look at a map here in a minute, that started more on the West Coast and then eventually drug itself over to the East side. But Colonel Richard Henry Pratt was one of the main people that started this phrase, and so that became the belief in and the intent of boarding schools. So the first intention of boarding schools was that they were used to assimilate Native Americans into the American way of life. So things that were done with this, most often when children were brought into the boarding schools, their hair was cut, especially our young men, who traditionally have always had long hair. Their hair was cut off, their clothes were changed, and so if they were wearing anything that was traditional garb, it was taken away from them. They no longer had it, and they had to speak in English. And even if they didn't understand it or they couldn't speak it, they had to speak it. And none of these things were allowed. So none of their traditional pieces were allowed during the time. And it even came into things such as the food that they eat. So if, for instance, for a lot of our Coast Salish people, our foods were fish, right? We were fishing, we hunted, so we were gatherers of the areas in the land around us. And so we were not able to eat those things. They were not necessarily readily available to us. We were given what the rations were for the time. It was also used to civilize, or in other words, break the, and I hate this phrase, these two phrases, but this is the vision of what it was at the time, the Stoic. And so you hear this, or you may have seen commercials even many years ago, and I've seen them, still not seen the commercials, but they've been used in classrooms that I've worked in and I've taught in, is the Stoic or the dirty Indian. And so during the time, and unfortunately, you may still hear this phrase, and it is not something that most Indigenous people prefer, is that we are very stoic. We don't show expression. We don't, the belief is that we didn't show expression. We didn't show warmth. We were very one-faced. We didn't do that. And that we were dirty. We were uncleanly. We didn't know how to take care of ourselves because we may have been covered in dirt or in paint for ceremony, or dirt after going and hunting and gathering as well. And last couple of intents were to strip the children from their families, language, and traditions. None of these were allowed at the boarding schools. You were not allowed to see your family. It was not often that you were allowed to go home during the summer, most often because, as we've talked about with ICWA, if you were able to be one of our previous presentations, as families couldn't afford to bring their children home because, as you're going to see the map, many of the boarding schools were not close by. There was no, you may be in Washington, but there is no boarding school in Washington. The closest one may be in Oregon. And so that's where your children are going, and you may not have the ability to bring them home. Again, the language was never taught. It was not spoken. If it was spoken, unfortunately, at most schools, there was a form of punishment. So again, we're going back into that epigenetics, that blood memory piece. And then the traditions. You were not allowed to practice powwow or traditional practices during the winter months, where you may need to do your traditional pieces in order to appease your ancestors and those around you as well. And overall, the best word that we can come up with is it was an ethnic genocide. The whole point, again, going back to kill the Indian, save the man, was to get rid of the Native American people, because the belief was if we could assimilate them into being white people or being assimilated into the the major population, that we could then create kind of this perfect generation, and that the Native American population would no longer exist, which if you continue to look at numbers in terms of different things such as enrollments in tribes and things along that, and even look at the genetic pieces of DNA for most tribal people, is the genocide is still happening today. And that is why you are seeing many tribes that are dying out, because many of the people within these tribes, there is two fields of belief, and I've talked to people with two very different fields of belief. There is a field of belief of, because of the epigenetics, is to marry into a non-Indigenous family, and so you marry into a different ethnicity, and your children continue to have mate with other ethnicities, so the population dies out. And then I've also actually had an instructor that he was very much the opposite. He wanted to very specifically mate and match and have children with another Indigenous person to keep the bloodlines running strong, because that was his understanding and belief of how to combat genocide. So these are the major intents of boarding schools. Obviously, there's many more that we can go into, but you would have to look at very specific boarding schools, because the people that ran the boarding schools were often missionaries or military. And so their intent for starting the boarding school was different to each individual person. Like, for instance, with Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, his very, very specific reason for starting Carlisle boarding school was to kill the Indian to save the man in his specific area.
I just want to do my Shoshaunee, is I just also want to mention that a lot of the things that prevented our children from coming home were intentional, right? Like, it was intentional that they shipped these kids from Washington to maybe 3 states away, right? It was intentional. It was intentional because that way they would not be able to go home. They would not be able to run home, because there was experiences of children running home. There's experiences of children trying to leave, trying to run, and understanding that kids died at the boarding schools. In just Canada alone, because the United States has never even looked into the numbers, in Canada alone, there's over 6,000 documented cases of children going missing, and that is documented cases. That is those that have kept records, because there are quite a few schools that maybe didn't keep records, or there was annotations of girls who were raped while at boarding schools, having children, and then they go missing. There's accounts of mass graves, and so I really want to make sure that we understand the severity of how much this has impacted. And not only has it impacted the children that attended these schools, that individual experience not only impacts their bloodline, but it also impacts the way in which their family dynamics between their parents and themselves when they do return home have changed. A lot of the schools didn't allow any kind of familial talking. So even if you saw your brothers or your sisters, you weren't allowed to talk to them, because you have to love God over family was the belief behind it. But it really was to create isolation, because a person whose spirit is broken and feeling isolated is a lot easier to control, right? And also, once those family dynamics have shifted, that also weakens the community as a whole too, because traditional community child rearing has shifted, right? I just wanted to add those parts.
Yes, thank you. All right, and so here is a map of off-reservation Indian boarding schools. And so there's also something to bring up here. So you can see them, they're spread out it kind of like does a little snake-like swoop across the country. But there is also something to mention as well that is not shown in this map. And there are what we called day schools. So oftentimes, because it was cheaper, unfortunately, to say those words, that families started to make the decision that they couldn't afford to send, for instance, for my family or Kateri's family here in the Pacific Northwest in the Coast Salish territory, we may not be able to send our children. Like I wouldn't possibly, if I was back in these times and I thought it was a good idea to send my daughter to Chamawa, I might not be able to afford that. But I could afford to send her to Tulalip, where there was a day school where she could learn the same things. She could learn how to be a white woman. She could learn how to raise a family. She could learn how to cook and clean for her husband. If I had a son, he could learn how to do, he could learn how to do any sort of the working tasks of the time. So working in factory settings, building things was very popular. Doing a lot of farm work was also another big popular thing that students were able to learn. They were also able to then learn to read and write English as well. And so just because we talk about boarding schools and going away to boarding schools and being taken away from, it doesn't take away from the fact or negate the fact that still the genocide was happening within people's own tribal communities by the introduction of the day schools. And so for my family in particular, I did have some family that were sent away to different states, but I also have a great history within my family of many of my great uncles and great aunts being sent to the Tulalip boarding school. And it's really strange also to explain this fact as well, because Northwest Indian College itself, if you come to visit our campus here in Bellingham, Washington, we actually have the original Lummi Day School. So the original place that was built for the Lummi children to come and to learn. And so there's a lot of different ways that children, unfortunately, in the family structure were basically torn apart so that our children and our communities could not thrive. So we could go back again to that phrase of kill the Indian to save the man. So you can kind of see the breadth of the tribal boarding schools. One thing I do want to mention is the way the map is set up, especially I always mention this if you look at South Dakota. Obviously there's many boarding schools in South Dakota because in the areas, so Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, you have a very strong even today, we still have a very strong high dense population of Native American people. And so that was a place that you could send students to, or your children to. But again, 9 times out of 10, the children, just like Kateri was just talking about, the children that were in those specific areas were not sent to those areas. So even though a person in South Dakota that may be from a tribe in South Dakota was probably not sent to school in South Dakota, they were actually probably sent maybe to Oklahoma or even brought over here to Oregon because they need to disconnect the familial ties and not allow for those children to try and return home. And if you do look at the map, for any of you that do know anything about tribal colleges and universities, you may see one name pop up at you that is still in existence today, and that is Haskell. Haskell was originally a boarding school, and now it is a tribal college. So that is just kind of something I do like to bring up as well. So if you do want to see the map, this was the best map that I could find with as many of the boarding schools that were out there that happened during this time. If you want to go to the next slide, Kateri.
I just wanted to like make sure that it's known that, like you were saying, there is a big variance in experiences, especially in which the ways in which children find themselves in these places. For some, it might have been that their parents had sent them because they felt like they couldn't compete in a Western society, and so they wanted to they thought that was the most appropriate way, especially if that's something that they've experienced themselves. But for the majority of our students, they were forced. Their children were physically forced from them. I mean, there are stories of like families and youth who kind of had like sister tribes, I guess, where they would send their kids to those areas to prevent them from being taken. And there are stories of kids who grew their entire life, they grew up running from being taken from these places, or being taken and sent to boarding school. So like there's just a big variance in experience. And also just like one thing to really remember is like the creation of the boarding schools was done with the BIA, and the BIA initially started in the War Department. So understanding that mind frame, that this was a way in which to handle the Indian problem was to, I mean, the fastest way to kill cultural, like the cultural aspects of a person's community is to take their children and then assimilate them to your own Western beliefs. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yes, and that's a really good point, because there were BIA, yes, it's Bureau of Indian Affairs. You are correct. There is the BIA and the BIE. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was what was created first. It's also, when Kateri is talking about that, is it was known, especially in communities, as the swooping day or the collecting day was often what it was called in the communities. And so that's when what Kateri is talking about would happen is parents would know that, they would get word that that the heads of the boarding schools, or the people that were meant to come and collect the children, were coming to the community, and they would send their children into different communities. They would oftentimes try and hide their children in different places as well. And with the intent and hope that these children would not have to be assimilated and move into these areas. And so it's very traumatic in terms of even just hearing the stories about the swooping days and coming in to collect the children, because that's what it was defined as. It was coming in to collect a group of people and take them away so they could not see their families. And so we were wanting to look at where boarding schools still exist, because today boarding schools do still exist. They did not just disappear and drop off the face of the earth, although I'm sure people like Kateri and I really want them to. It's a terrible memory. Canada has done some great work in the First Nations to do some reconciliation in this aspect and in this work. Unfortunately, the United States has not gotten that progressive yet. And so these boarding schools do still exist. So this is a quote from Mark Cruz. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for, and again, this is something to think about again as well. When we're talking about boarding schools, where Kateri was talking about under the Department of War, so policy and economic development for Indian Affairs. That is what this gentleman does, and that is where these boarding schools still lie. They don't lie within the economic development, within the social structure of these tribes. They are run for specific policy and economic gain, and that's where they have stayed for decades and years. So the quote from Mark Cruz in regards to where the boarding schools still exist is the Bureau of Indian Education. So Kateri, you heard Kateri mention the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so that is one piece of it, and then from that became the Bureau of Indian Education. And so these are two different entities. They do work together, but they are two separate entities. So the Bureau of Indian Education directly operates 4 off-reservation boarding schools in 4 states: Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, Oklahoma; Sherman Indian School in Riverside, California; Chamawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon; and Flandry Indian School in Flandry, South Dakota. Additionally, there are 3 tribally controlled boarding schools. So that means tribally controlled means that the tribe within the area that the school is in owns and operates the school, and usually it is their population that attends the school. So they're not that, again, where we go back to like kind of like the day school idea. Children go there during the day and can go home. Boarding schools are off reservation. We're sending our youth to these places for them to live and to go to school. So 2 different kinds of ideas. So Sequoia schools in, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher this so bad. Kateri, do you know how to say it? No? Okay, I'm not going to get it.
I don't know, but I would, my guess would be Talalaqua.
There we go. That works for me. In Oklahoma, the Pierre Indian Learning Center in Pierre, South Dakota, and the Circle of Nations School in Wafton, North Dakota. So you can see that it looks like in total we have 7 boarding schools, or 4 boarding schools and 3 day schools that are still in existence, that our children are going to, our youth are going to today. And so it is not uncommon for this to happen. Working at Northwest Indian College for the last 10 years, unfortunately, it's weird to say this, but we go and recruit at these schools because the population is all Native American and Indigenous. And so we have students that, I have students that, I'm kidding you, that are graduating this year that are looking at coming to Northwest Indian College. So that shows you how strong in existence these schools are still happening today. So boarding schools are not something of the past. They are historical in nature, but they are not historical in the actual physical being that they do not exist anymore. They do still exist. They are still in existence, and you will find students that are at these schools. And there may be in students, if you are working as a practitioner, you may find students that youth that you are working with that may have been at these schools at some point in their upbringing. And because of that population or things that have happened, that may be why they may be in the foster care system or may even be homeless. And so you may be interacting with somebody that, yes, does have that epigenetic blood memory of boarding schools, but they also have a very, very lived experience of being in one themselves. So manifestation in students. So this is from a collegiate standpoint, and I'm sure Kateri can also vouch for a lot of this, seeing this in our younger students as well. I have seen this working with students across the board while working with them in high school and working with them coming into college. So the things that you may see in students is lower testing scores. This may be placement scores, ACT scores, SAT scores, HISP scores, since we're all in the state of Washington. So HISP scores, MAP scores, I think is the newest one. My mom's a teacher. She tries to keep me up to date on all the proctoring and testing that happens in the great world of education. And so the reason that we see these oftentimes is because if you think back to the traditional, if you've been a part of a couple presentations that Kateri and I have done, is our ancestors are very oral. We learn in oral settings, and we also learn by doing and by listening. And so when you're asking us to do a pen and paper sort of thing, we don't necessarily excel in those. We are more hands-on, more touch-based. And so it is often found that lower testing scores happen. For example, for students that I have worked with, most of our students in our tribally controlled areas that do our placement testing do not test above developmental English. And so for those of you that don't work or have connections in the college setting, that means they're testing below 100 levels. So they're not entering in at college level, which means that there's something happening there with testing. We also have a lot of students that have a great fear of testing as well. You also may see lower grades in students as well. It is very typical in a lot of reports that I read when doing different research for Native youth, is that especially during our winter time, our youth, our traditionally culturally connected youth, are oftentimes doing cultural aspects to take care of themselves and to take care of their families. And so there's a lot of schools that are working on, especially in the Plains areas, that are working on shifting how they do attendance and things along those lines, because for Indigenous people, family comes first. And so we're not necessarily in the classroom. But the other reason also is that it's a kind of a combined piece, is during the epigenetics piece, if your family has a disdain for going to school, or they're seeing that their older people in their family are choosing to not continue to go to school and don't have a value in that because of what they have endured and survived, they're going to emulate what is happening as well outside of that. The biggest one when it comes to students going into post-secondary institutions is there's a very strong fear of leaving home to go to school. There's a very strong fear. We hear it all the time at our college of, I have to go home for ceremony. I don't know what's going to happen when I'm gone. I'm afraid, my grandmother is not doing well. I'm afraid of losing her. There's a very strong fear of what will happen if I go outside of my state, outside of my city to go to school to get an education. What's going to happen? What's going to change? Am I going to be welcomed back into my community after I leave as well? So those are some really big pieces, which is often why we see Indigenous students choosing to go to community colleges, technical colleges, or schooling within their specific area that's not very far from them. That's why we oftentimes don't see Indigenous students potentially reaching to say, I want to go to Harvard, or I want to go, I want to go to UCLA, or schools like that that are outside of their local network where they feel safe. There's also an inconsistency in school. So there's a constant leaving and returning. It's not uncommon, especially for our tribal students and our students that are older, that they're constantly leaving and coming back and going to school in and out. It's for different reasons. All of it is for different reasons. It could be that they are going home to raise a family. It could be that they are going to work because they are fearful of not being able to support themselves or their children. There's all different kinds of reasons. And so it is not very common or very often that Indigenous youth fit the mold of leaving from high school right at 18. They graduate, they go away to school, they earn their bachelor's degree, and they return. Usually there's a break in there somewhere, no matter what time it is, or there may be a few breaks as well. And so it's being able to work with students and understand the inconsistency. And so the phrasing that I usually use with my students is, school will always be here and we will be here when you're ready. That's a great way to kind of counterbalance that, because that goes with the next point that I'm going to make, which is fear of failure and constant apologies. I'm sure Kateri could talk about this as well. Working in the education sector, my students apologize to me for everything, right? They apologize to me for not being in class. They apologize to me for a failing grade, for needing to leave school to go home and take care of something, because they have a very strong fear of failure. And that, unfortunately, this is something that has also been perpetuated by different other systems in their life. And so they will constantly apologize. And so that's why I go back to telling my students that it's okay, it's going to happen. We will be here when you're ready. And when you are ready is when it's time to come back. And there's nothing wrong with that. And normalizing that for a student, and within this manifestation, normalizing that it is okay to have a bump in the road, whatever that may look like, is something to definitely do. Imposter syndrome is a big one. The feeling of not belonging, especially in our students that are looking to go to the bigger schools, so looking at University of Washington or even just universities in general. There is a huge fear of imposter syndrome, especially when those failures start to happen. Some students go in with that great confidence. They've had a great support network around them. They know that they can do it. They go and they believe it. That first low grade happens, and then the imposter syndrome starts, and they really start to question whether or not they belong there. And that will then trigger some other things to happen, kind of in this list, and some things outside of this list. And they need to understand, this is the one thing, especially with our Indigenous youth that we're seeing today that are getting ready to exit high school, is they need to understand how it impacts their future. I do not get students that come into my office and select a program because it sounds great. Students, Indigenous students in particular, need to know that they are able to provide for their family, that they're able to provide for themselves and their communities. And so they need to understand how the decisions they are making impact their future. The degree that they're choosing has to impact their community. I don't see any students saying, this degree sounds really cool. I have students that come in and say, I really want to go back to my community to start a drug and alcohol clinic for the teens in my community. I was a teen that lived that life, and I know there's a lot there. This is what I want to do. So being able to, especially if you're working with a student, it is really important to bring in intergenerations. So to have the conversations with their family, with their elders, with their friends, and that you will notice that they will, oftentimes they lean over and they ask mom or dad, what do you think about this? And so having those consistent conversations and being able to understand that a student may need to walk away. You may give them information and they may need to say, I need to think about it, or I need to talk to my family. And that is a very normal piece of working with an Indigenous youth as well. And then intergenerational trauma, it still happens. We talked about this obviously at our last session at the conference as well, but intergenerational trauma still happens. And so students are still feeling and experiencing things that have happened to their ancestors and to their elders, heck, even to their cousins as well. And so being aware of how that manifests itself, maybe it is in what we deem as misbehaving or things along those lines. And so being able to kind of see some of these manifestations in your students, or even just seeing the behavior in your students, and now you have an understanding of maybe why those manifestations are happening. And trust me, I'm sure we could come up with an hour-long presentation on the different manifestations that happen because of the intergenerational trauma and blood memory. But it helps to possibly redirect and reframe how you work with a student to help them be more successful, which ultimately helps the trust and boundaries with you as an individual as well.
I think along those lines too is just understanding that for a lot of our students, especially ones that are coming from like tribal schools, it's a huge culture shock. I mean, it's a culture shock for any student coming from a high school to a university or a college. Just like the way in which everything works, the independence and all of the ways in which it's impacted, but especially for our youth coming from tribal schools. A lot of times they're coming from schools that are small enough to where literally everybody knows everybody, where the front end staff could tell you, what's happening, not just with that student, but they can tell you what's happening with that family, or who's connected to who and whose bloodline is connected, to being in a classroom where the teacher doesn't even, or the professor doesn't even know if you're a student, let alone all the different things that could potentially happening at home or in the community that would impact their experience, like deaths in the family. And they're coming from a tribal school, everyone knows when there's a death in the community. And that will impact the way in which everyone experiences, school. So it's a huge difference, right? And also a lot of times just thinking back about the blood memory, thinking about how it's always been outside entities that have come into tribal communities and have negatively impacted them and their communities. And so a lot of times our students don't ask for help because there's that fear of that, if you ask for help, then there could be a potential that it's somehow either they or their family are going to get in trouble somehow, and that could negatively impact them. So just like being really aware of how consistent you have to be with our students, and how slow moving relationships have to go and how much it has to be on their terms, the students' terms, in order for it to be a positive relationship. And just consistency, and being there when you can, when it's appropriate, but also just recognizing when it's time to back off too. So one thing that it's really confusing sometimes is, especially when you're having to do paperwork, the understanding that data is not always clear and that depending on where you're getting your information from who's in foster care can be really, really confusing. So there are 3 different types of child welfare jurisdiction in Washington state. There's tribal jurisdiction, which means the tribe is has sole jurisdiction over the case and the youth. And so their data is held within that tribe, right? So they have ultimate access to that data, and they can choose or not choose to tell who's there, right? It's just like any other thing. I always think about whenever I'm thinking about tribes is 2 different countries because they have sovereignty. So they are independent nations within the United States. So thinking about if I'm gathering my information from the United States, right, and that person is Canadian, I can't get access to their information unless I talk to a Canadian representative, right? And that's how you have to think about it when you're thinking about tribal nations, is that you can't ask Canada for Mexico's information because they are not the same system. They're not the same country. And so it's the same thing with all of our tribes. You can't ask Tulalip for information about Lummi because they are different nations. They're all of their data is separate and it's unique and it's independent. For our students that are in DCYF in state jurisdiction, then their information can be pulled to the Cedars report. And there are some students or some youth who have congruent jurisdictions. So that means they have both a state and tribal social worker. And there's typically like a primary and a secondary, and that determination of who's primary, who's secondary is something that the state and the tribe have to work out. You know, I don't want to say what like that whenever that's happening, that it's always a state or it's always a tribe, because it really just depends on that specific situation and the way in which those two systems interact with each other, because it's really confusing. So these are just some resources that we thought of that would be helpful, specifically for the information we talked about. So for films, there is Blood Memory in Dawnland, and it's basically documentaries that really discuss you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Council that that Shoshaunee was talking about through Dawnland. Blood Memory is really through the experience of I can't remember her first name. Is it, oh my gosh, something Whitefoot. Oh my gosh. Anyways, it's about this woman's experience, through her lived experience as being a child during the Scoop era, and being adopted out of the reservation, her kind of coming home, and then her attempt to really bring those who've experienced forced adoption out of community back into their tribes over in South Dakota. And Indian Horse is a fictional movie that is very much based on like real stories of survivors that have survived residential school or boarding school. And so it's kind of like this fictitious character that is experiencing real life accounts of other people's stories, so that makes sense. And then through books, there's Facing the Future, which is really kind of a more in detailed explanation of ICWA in Trellifer Act. The Roundhouse is kind of like a similar thing to Indian Horse, where it's a fictitious story of about a specific person that really brings in a lot of the Indian laws that impact Indian country. And The Woman Who Watches Over the World from Linda Hogan is really talking more in depth about blood memory in general, and kind of like the way in which she experiences it and explains it. And then some websites, I just put NICWA, which is the National Indian Child Welfare Association. There are lots of other websites. There's websites on specifically boarding schools up in Canada, residential, and lots of other ones. That was what I just put down though. With our last 10 minutes, is there any questions? So there is a question in the chat. Shoshaunee, I might give this one to you. What are the primary objectives of the 4 current off-reservation boarding schools run by the EIE, and why do they still exist?
I wish I had a very explicit answer for that. Unfortunately, there's not really an explicit answer. It's kind of also like asking the question, or kind of why do tribal schools exist, right? The concept and the hope is that the knowledge that is given at these boarding schools, I haven't had the ability to talk with a lot of our students that have had the most recent experiences at the boarding schools that still exist. But oftentimes, the one student that I can think of, she was in the foster care system. And so from what she had detailed to me was that was just like Kateri was talking about, that was part of that case management piece. And so that was, it would have been a safe place for her to go and live and also receive an education. So that could possibly be some of the primary reasons. But it's also just, you probably have to do some more research. Like I said, it was really hard for me to doing research, knowing the organizations to even look for, to really get a bunch of information on the current boarding schools that still exist. It's not something that's talked about very much. You would really have to, I think, kind of maybe visit their website and kind of remember that you're picking through something with a grain of sand in terms of the information that's given to you. I think the hope would be that they are receiving a great education that is Indigenous based and Indigenous focused, like our tribal colleges do. But there's no guarantee of that, obviously, with it being run by the Bureau of Indian Education.
Is there any other questions? I'm gonna go ahead and also I forgot to share like our contact information,
Yeah.
just so that way if folks have follow-up questions and they want to reach us, you have access that way.
Great. Let's see if any other questions come through. So we do have a question for Kateri.
Yeah, I could definitely talk about my work at Treehouse. So one thing to mention about my work specifically is my role has really been something that Treehouse has created as a way to really invest and focus on our youth who are furthest from educational opportunity. And that is our tribal kids, because our tribal kids have historically been the winner of all the negative stereotypes, right? The winner of having the lowest graduation rates, the highest impacted by the juvenile justice system, by pretty much, and the foster care system, all disproportionately impacted. There were also the ones that are that have the highest statistics for death by police brutality and by sexual assault. And in order to really change the way in which Treehouse supports our youth, is really important to be really intentional about the ways in which we support them, right? We're attempting to, one, make sure that everything that we do is done with collaboration. And so a lot of my work has been kind of like reviewing our current practices and trying to make it more culturally appropriate for our tribal communities that we're working with. Also to hopefully expand into serving more tribal communities versus the ones that we already have connections with. And I have to do a lot of this, right? Like it's really important to Treehouse that not only do we as an organization do the work to be more culturally appropriate and to really train. So I do a lot of internal staff trainings. I do a lot of these external staff external trainings specifically with our partners, because if we're working collaboratively with other community partners and they may have not had trainings like this or had access to it and are working through a very Western viewpoint and perspective. And we're trying to work in collaboration, but they might be doing harm to our kids, and unintentional harm. But if you don't have the framework and understanding in the context in ways in which outside entities have impacted tribal communities, then there's a really good chance you might go in there in not a good way and really affect the ways in which our relationships are built or those missteps that are created. So my role is constantly changing. So it's really hard to describe what I do. I try really hard. That's all I do.
Thank you both. We do have one more question, and then after this question, we'll wrap up. So the question's from Gabby. How can we educate others who, when we are ourselves learning, is there something that you recommend?
I mean, one thing I really recommend is just like, one, we're all learning, right? Like I'm still learning. I still count on my mentors, people who I trust to kind of help lead me in the work that I'm currently doing. So there's a couple different things that like I always think about. I always think about like, what are your intentions behind the work that you're doing? Like, is it to better your stance, or is it better to serve whoever you're attempting to help, right? Where's your heart at? And also being really intentional about doing the best you can to do your own internal self-reflection, your self-work, and do your own research when you can. And then, being an ally to those who, man, this is really emotionally draining for these presentations. It's also really emotionally draining when you think about your like BIPOC coworkers who might be in spaces where they are the minority. I mean, most of the time they're minority in professional spaces. And if you feel that something is inappropriate, calling those people out as an ally is really, really nice, so that the other only person of color or the like BIPOC person in the room doesn't constantly have to be the one to say it, right? Those are ways that you can support, and those ways you can hold your coworkers and others accountable, and just being humble, right? Like understanding that we're all learning, but being open to feedback and being open to knowing where you're at and being realistic at where you're at and continuously trying to improve.
I would also add making sure if you're working with a specific tribal community, I think Kateri talked about this very specifically in the first webinar that we did, is being present in that community. Trust is a very big thing when you're working with Indigenous youth or Indigenous communities. Like Kateri said, we're winners of some of the worst pieces of American history, just like other ethnic minorities as well. And so being there, being an ally, listening, asking questions, and networking as much as possible. And if you're working in an education setting, the biggest thing that Indigenous youth tend to gravitate towards is kind of that raw honesty. And so sharing your story, sharing the things that have happened that have been missteps for you, because of that imposter syndrome and the inability to connect with somebody that may come from privilege. And you went to college right out of high school, you had no problems, you graduated right away. It's really hard, and they can feel that they're not understood. And so talking about and empathizing with the students on things that have happened that were learnings, setbacks and learning objectives for you during your journey will definitely help you, especially if you're working with any Indigenous youth that is getting ready to go to post-secondary, because they're already feeling fearful and afraid, and they oftentimes feel that the person that they're walking into the room with is better than they are. And so they oftentimes fear authority. And so if you can kind of break that barrier, breaking bread is a really important thing with a lot of our youth, just having water or snacks, or heck, in my office, I have candy. I bring all of my candy like after holidays and it's always gone. But it's just a great way to create conversation and to make it a not so rigid approach. So a not so rigid place, a not so like, we're just going to go over this information and that's it. Just kind of have the conversation and be open to what changes and how that shifts during that moment. And just like Kateri said, knowing when to be there and also knowing when to back off, because there's going to be times where you have to do both, and you have to do both in one setting, and in like 5 seconds change time is really important with Indigenous.
Thank you both. We do have a comment, and then I'll just wrap up with some closing remarks. So an appreciation for the explanation of blood memory as it relates to intergenerational trauma, and list of resources so that folks can learn more on their own time. And with that, Kateri and Shoshaunee, I sincerely want to thank you both so much for all of your energy and time, and sharing your personal experiences in addition to just your expertise on this topic, and really important topic too. And yeah, it was definitely eye-opening for me and informative, and I always learn new things every time I participate in a webinar that the both of you present on and topic that you present on. And just want to appreciate all that you do to continue to educate your peers. And thank you to all of the webinar participants for joining us this afternoon and for asking your insightful questions and comments. It's always great to have kind of an active chat after the webinar. And with that, I'd like to just send a reminder that there is a post-webinar survey for everyone that will pop up on your screen as soon as this webinar ends. And then again, a copy of this recording will be on the YouTube channel later this week. All right, thanks everyone. And please continue to take care and wear your mask and continue to social distance for the time being. Okay, everyone, see you next month for our April webinar. Bye.